I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another edition of the best movie you never saw. And this week we're going to talk about Walter Hill's crazy mashup of a rock opera slash action flick, Streets of Fire, starring Michael Pare as Tom Cody, a soldier of fortune who returns home to rescue his former girlfriend, rock star Ellen Aim, played by the absolutely gorgeous Diane Lane, who's been kidnapped by a bunch of bikers led by the psychotic Raven, played by none other than Willem Dafoe. Amy Madigan co-stars, as does Rick Moranis. And this was produced by Lawrence Gordon and Joel Silver. If this duo sounds familiar to you, it's because they pretty much produced every good 80s action movie, including Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and 48 Hours. And of course, 48 Hours is what brought them to Walter Hill. Streets of Fire, in some ways, is a product of the success of that movie, which was a surprise mega hit in 1982. It launched the career of star Eddie Murphy, but it also made the creative team behind it, including director Walter Hill and co-writer Larry Gross, and producers Lawrence Gordon and Joel Silver, hot properties. Wanting to crank out another huge hit, I'm sure they figured Streets of Fire couldn't miss. I mean, after all, the mid-80s were the heyday of MTV, and this was to be a music-driven action movie with songs by Jim Steinman, who had two smash hits in 1983, around the time they were ramping up production, a year before this hit theaters, with Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart and Air Supply's Making Love Out of Nothing at All. Now, with a solid $14.5 million budget, Hill was able to make something not unlike his own The Warriors, albeit on a much bigger scale, setting it in a non-distinct city in an obscure time period that seems to be patterned after the 50s, however with a huge dose of 80s new wave mixed in, or as the pre-credits title card simply says, it's another time, another place. They had a hot cast with Michael Pare coming right off of Eddie and the Cruisers and doing his best Robert Mitchum as the tough guy hero Tom Cody. Now, how did he get the part? Well, at the time, On the Dark Side was a huge hit song, and actually a lot of people thought that Michael Pare was the one doing the singing because the music video was actually just a clip from Eddie and the Cruisers, where he lip-synced to the song. In fact, the guy who actually sang the song was a guy named John Cafferty, and I think when people found out that John Cafferty and Michael Pare weren't the same, people got a little bit upset. But anyway, Michael Pare was cast in this movie, as was an 18-year-old Diane Lane, who was really a rising star at the time, coming off back-to-back Francis Ford Coppola movies, The Outsiders and Rumblefish, with a third, The Cotton Club, also in the making. Now, The Cotton Club was a really buzzed-about movie at the time, even though it came and went pretty quickly at the end of the year. Now, given how big movies like Flashdance and Footloose were at the time, both of them were kinda sorta musicals like this, you can't blame Hill and company for their ambitions. Not only would this have a ton of pop music, but it also had action. And it wound up being, unfortunately, a huge flop, grossing only $8.1 million at the box office, a really terrible result for a summer action movie. Nevertheless, it became something of a cult hit on VHS, and one of the songs from the soundtrack, Down Hartman's I Can Dream About You, actually became a top 10 hit in North America. Way more successful than the movie itself, although I would bet that at the time the movie was such a bomb that people didn't even realize that the song was off the soundtrack album. Joel Silver was apparently so dismayed by the box office results that when he got this on the Sunday morning from the studio and he found out how much the movie had grossed, he made kind of a spin on one of the names of the songs. In the movie, they play a song called Tonight Is What It Means to Be Young, while Joel Silver, when he saw the box office results, said, Tonight is what it means to be dead. Now, say what you will about Streets of Fire, but it's very unique. I mean, how many action movie musicals can you think of? Zero, right? I mean, even in an era that was dominated by music videos, this must have seemed pretty bold, but throughout his career, Hill's always been one to push the envelope, something which continues to this day with his recent reassignment generating copious amounts of press. Now, it wasn't a great movie, but Hill at this time in the 80s was really on fire. He's always had kind of a comic book movie aesthetic, and I think Streets of Fire is probably his most realized project in that regard, from the production design right down to the characters. Now, in a Hill interview that he did with the WGA, he explained it this way: I thought I could handle things. I didn't know how to shoot music. Music had been important to my films, but it was usually post-production. That was tough stuff to shoot. I already had great respect for people like Minnelli, in terms of Vincent Minnelli. I just couldn't seem to work it out without putting multiple cameras around and shooting an awful lot of film. I later realized or talked to people about this, and MGM in the old days, everybody was just on contract and they would rehearse for weeks and weeks. We didn't get that. We would stage it and shoot it. We got a lot of the songs, a lot of the times just a few days before we shot. We only get the final song. The structural advantage of the old studio system that we didn't have made for a really inefficient shoot. I didn't think there was any other way to do it given the circumstances. Now, of course, that's probably why the movie had such a huge budget, $14.5 million, which seems expensive if you watch the movie, considering that, Star Wars in 1977 only cost $10 million. Now, Michael Pare and Willem Dafoe are particularly interesting in this, with each giving heightened performances that may have actually rubbed audiences the wrong way in 1984, but seem kind of legit now, especially given the modern dominance of the comic book film. Pare in particular should have become a much bigger star, but the 80s were not really an era for the kind of cynical, low-key hero he's playing here. Audiences either went for a square-jawed classic Harrison Ford type or muscle men like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone. Pare is a lot like Michael Biehn in that regard. Both guys probably would have had much bigger careers had they come along 20 years later, heck, even 10 years later. Now, Streets of Fire was also an early shot at stardom for Diane Lane, who's impossibly gorgeous as rock star Ellen Aim, and I think was about 18 when they shot this. While she didn't do her own singing, she lip-syncs like a pro and looks terrific in Aim's far-out new wave outfits. Another great performance in this movie, and I have to single it out, is given here by Amy Madigan, who hasn't acted too much in recent years, but was terrific as the earthy leading lady of the time, and you can check her out in Uncle Buck or Field of Dreams. She's terrific in both of those movies. She steals a whole lot of scenes as Michael Pare's sidekick, a gunslinger named McCoy, who apparently was written as a man until Madigan came along. Now, Rick Moranis is also cast against type in a much more cynical role than we're used to. He usually plays the nerd. He's kind of a nerd here, but he has kind of an edge to him. He's very cynical and seems like a bit of a vessel for Hill to make some sly commentary on the state of the music business, with him valuing money above other things, even if he, Natch, turns out to be kind of an okay guy in the end.
You know something, Waldo? We're gonna be rich. Yeah. Long live rock and roll.
It helps that Streets of Fire is an insanely propulsive flick, with Hill and his 3 editors keeping the thing rolling along like a freight train throughout its 93-minute running time. Hill also manages to sprinkle in some impressive action set pieces, including Cody's raid on the biker hangout, his opening fisticuffs battle with some knife-wielding thugs who try to rob his sister, played by the Warriors' Deborah Van Valkenburg, and best of all, the epic sledgehammer fight finale. Now, Michael Pare actually talked about this when he gave an interview to Ain't It Cool News. You gotta realize that out of the whole cast, nobody was over 30. Diane Lane, I think, was 18. It was an enormous Hollywood production. My manager had me hire a limousine to pick me up at home and take me to work, and I was like, Jesus, this is incredible. This is Hollywood. The real Hollywood. The Hollywood they make movies about. And it was scary. And Walter isn't the kind of guy who works well with kids. He's a cowboy. He's like John Ford. Don't ask me how to act, he'd say. I'm a director. Now, for me, Walter Hill does a really good job staging the MTV scenes. My favorite scene in the movie, of course, is the sledgehammer fight at the end, but I don't want to ruin that for anybody who hasn't actually seen the movie. But one moment that's actually great is the pre-credits opening, where Lane is in full rockstar mode, lip-syncing to the catchy Nowhere Fast, while baddie William Dafoe and his crew, including the punk band Fear's Lee Ving, plan to snatch her.
He's a bunch of f***ing jerk-offs, do you know that?
Everything right from the time they say another time, another place, to the part where Ellen Aim gets dragged away on Willem Dafoe's motorcycle is absolutely perfect. I mean, it's cut in time to the propulsive music, which is a mix of Roy Cooder's score and Jim Steinman's songs. In fact, I saw this movie on 35mm at a revival screening about 3 years ago, and the audience was just rocking throughout this opening, and it sets a high bar for the movie, and I'm surprised that it wasn't a bigger hit. Now, if you want to see Streets of Fire, you can actually catch it in a lot of ways. It's out on DVD, and Shout Factory actually did a really good re-release of it on Blu-ray. It also shows up on a lot of streaming services. You can get it on iTunes. It's been on Netflix from time to time, and if you want to see the movie, I mean, it's out there. You can check it out. Now, it's nice that Streets of Fire has indeed picked up some kind of cult following over the years. Not enough people, in my opinion, have heard of it. It's a really cool little 80s gem and a good entree into Summer Hill's more obscure but great works like Extreme Prejudice and Johnny Handsome. For what it's worth, Michael Pare is still doing pretty good work, having had a cameo in the recent Bone Tomahawk and a really solid part as Barry Seal in The Infiltrator, and a starring role in our own John Fallon's The Shelter, who you may all know as the editor-in-chief of Arrow in the Head. Check it out, it's a great little movie. As for Diane Lane, well, I mean, she's still impossibly beautiful, right? I guess some things never change. Until next time, I'm Chris Bumbray for JoBlo.com.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris here again for JoBlo.com with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the Ridley Scott Michael Douglas movie Black Rain. In it, Michael Douglas plays a corrupt American cop who, along with his partner played by a young Andy Garcia, winds up in Japan after a prisoner exchange gone awry. With their former captive cutting a swath through the local Yakuza in an attempt to establish himself as the new Tokyo boss, the cops are forced into an uneasy alliance with a by-the-book local inspector played by Ken Takakura, who's probably one of the biggest stars in Japanese film history. In addition to Michael Douglas, Andy Garcia, and Ken Takakura, this co-stars Kate Capshaw and Yasuko Matsuda, who was a big star in Japan in the 80s and who this was the last role of before he passed away tragically young to cancer. Directed by Ridley Scott, this has a great soundtrack by Hans Zimmer. Now, Michael Douglas was riding high in 1989. Following his Oscar win for Wall Street and Fatal Attraction's boffo box office, he was considered one of the most bankable actors in Hollywood. Opting for a rare action role, grittier and more hard-edged than his turns in Romancing the Stone and The Jewel of the Nile, Douglas, with his Fatal Attraction producers Stanley Jaffe and Sherry Lansing, who would go on to run Paramount Pictures, hired Ridley Scott, then on a career downswing following Legend and Someone to Watch Over Me, to helm this stylish East meets West thriller, which would be shot on location in Japan. Despite critical acclaim and Douglas's star power, Black Rain was only a modest hit upon its release in 1989. It grossed $46 million, decent enough numbers for the era, but it wound up grossing far less than comparable action movies of the time, although worldwide it was a pretty solid hit, grossing an additional $88 million, while it also became a pretty hot rental on the VHS market. Nowadays, Black Rain remains popular amongst aficionados of 80s action cinema, although I'd imagine people that aren't into that genre probably know nothing about it. And I think it probably remains Michael Douglas's one real attempt to make an action movie on par with what Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were doing at the time. Sandwiched between Douglas's more well-known vehicles, with Basic Instinct, another giant hit just a few years later, and coming along at a fallow time in Ridley Scott's career, it remains a movie that's rarely discussed in examinations of either. Now, Black Rain is an 80s gem for many reasons. For one thing, Michael Douglas aces his anti-hero part while introducing him by staging a motorcycle race while he rides along to a Greg Allman song is maybe trying a little too hard to establish him as a sexy rebel. It's notable that his character Nick Conklin is allowed to be sleazy and imperfect. He's under an investigation for being on the take, and with another actor in the lead, he'd probably be eventually vindicated. But we learn early on that Nick is in fact guilty. He was on the take. He's also shown, at first, to be something of a racist.
Did you translate every word? I want every word translated, you understand?
Yes, I understand.
Making derogatory comments about the Japanese, and often screwing up his own investigation with a mixture of ego and foolheadedness, all of which eventually gets his partner, played by the great Andy Garcia, decapitated in a really brutal scene. However, lest you think he's totally unlikable, Douglas does indeed make Nick three-dimensional, to the point that even if we know he's not far removed from the baddies he chases, he's essentially a good man, and his evolution is convincing. His relationship with Ken Takakura's more honorable Japanese cop, himself a victim of the rigid class system in Japan, is touching. It's the best thing about the movie, and Douglas initially treats him like a joke but comes to realize that Takakura, who's like the Chow Yun-fat of Japan, is truly on his side and an honorable man. Meanwhile, Yasuko Matsuda's bad guy is among the scarier ones of the 80s, sporting this crazed look and a sense of sadism. Matsuda was, unbeknownst to the filmmakers and Douglas himself, terminally ill at the time, and he apparently knew this would be his last role, so he put everything he had into it. Likewise, Ridley Scott, who one might assume would phone in to him, which must have seemed like a routine assignment, instead infused Black Rain with oodles of style. His vision of Tokyo almost seems as futuristic as the Los Angeles of Blade Runner, and his eye, matched with Jan de Bont's cinematography and Hans Zimmer's amazing hard-edged score, makes this one of the most impeccably made action films of the era. And what's really interesting is that Ridley Scott, if you know his work, often has multiple cuts. And indeed, when Ridley Scott turned in Black Rain, it was way over length. As Sherry Lansing said on the Black Rain DVD, I remember when Ridley showed us the first cut of the movie. It was about 2 hours and 40 minutes, and it was extraordinary. But this was his first cut, and we all knew he was going to go in and make the film under 2 hours. I mean, the texture of the movie, the performances, the visuals, the sound, we were thrilled. Then Ridley called us back, 4 weeks later, and showed us a movie that was 1 hour and 50 minutes long. We looked at him and asked, "What did you do?" And he said, "What do you mean, what did I do?" I said, "You took out all the good stuff. Why did you make it into this?" And he said, "But I had to."
And indeed, he did have to. To make it under 2 hours, he had to take out some of the texture and some of the finest scenes in the movie. So we just said to him, make it the right length. It doesn't have to be under 2 hours. Just make it the right length. And as a note, folks, the final cut runs 125 minutes, and it's probably one of the few Ridley Scott movies that he hasn't felt the need to reissue in a director's cut because Lansing kinda gave him final cut. It just goes to show you that sometimes creative freedom isn't necessarily a bad thing. And people actually liked this movie quite a bit when it came out. Michael Douglas himself, in an interview, again on the Black Rain DVD, said that I remember when the picture first came out, there were very influential critics who called it a racist film because of how it depicted the Japanese, and this really bothered me, so I called him up and asked him, have you ever been to Japan? Silence. No. Then what do you think you're talking about? Then a few weeks later, it gets nominated for Best Foreign Film in Japan. A very respected critic said, well, this is the best Japanese film I've seen this year, and that was a real compliment to Ridley. Now, I do think that Douglas may be exaggerating things a little bit, but I also think that Black Rain holds up really well as a time capsule of the 80s and a time capsule of a time when a lot of the technology and a lot of the commerce was going to Japan. Think of it back then. How many electronics did you buy that were made in Japan? It was booming at the time. And I think the movie is extremely evocative of that. People might be a little bit upset if you haven't seen this movie that I revealed that Andy Garcia dies. Thing is, in cop movies, especially cop movies of the 80s and early 90s, the younger, more experienced partner is always going to die. It's just a given. Even as a child watching Black Rain, I had seen enough of these movies to know that Andy Garcia was absolutely doomed. And as an action junkie, you almost look forward to the partner dying because it'll kick the hero into high gear. And yes, this movie definitely does that, but Andy Garcia is so damn likable and charismatic, singing Ray Charles with Takakura, who apparently loved Garcia off screen. And busting Douglas's balls that, you know what, you kinda want him to pull through. All of this makes his eventual death all the more hard-hitting, with it being, in the annals of action movie murders, one of the most sadistic. I mean, Garcia literally loses his head. Oh boy. Black Rain is easily available on DVD and Blu-ray, and it's streaming on quite a few sites for free, and of course you can buy it on iTunes, Amazon, and more. And I would say this is probably worth a blind buy if you don't want to just watch it on a streaming site, because it really does hold up. As Michael Douglas himself said on the Black Rain DVD, you know, people always ask me in my career, what's your favorite movie? And I have to say, Black Rain is right up there for me for the unique qualities in the movie. The execution across the board was terrific. And Black Rain is another entry into this column that, yes, many of you may remember having seen when it came out, but if it's been a while, I urge you to check it out again, as it holds up really well. And to those younger readers who may never have heard of it, do you like Ridley Scott? Do you like Hans Zimmer? I mean, of course you like Michael Douglas, who doesn't? So, if it's yes to all those three, then boy oh boy, are you gonna love this. Until next time, for JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.
JoBlo, he sure likes to drink a lot. And JoBlo watches movie like the hero.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again for JoBlo.com with another video edition of the best movie you never saw, and this week we're taking a look at John Badham's Blue Thunder. Now, John Badham is a name that should be well known to kids who grew up in the 80s. He directed a lot of the most popular movies of that era, including War Games, Stakeout, and Bird on a Wire, The Hard Way, and in addition to Saturday Night Fever back in 1977. This is written by Dan O'Bannon, who also wrote Alien and Total Recall, Don Jacoby, who also wrote The Philadelphia Experiment and John Carpenter's Vampires, and it stars the late great Roy Scheider, Malcolm McDowell, Candy Clark, who you may all remember from American Graffiti, Daniel Stern, and this was one of his first roles, and the late great Warren Oates, who died shortly after principal photography on this film.
The score was by Arthur B. Rubinstein, who composed the soundtrack for most of John Badham's movies during this era, including Stakeout, The Hard Way, and War Games. This movie revolves around a helicopter pilot working for the LAPD named Frank Murphy, played by Roy Scheider, and he's selected to test pilot an experimental government helicopter that's called Blue Thunder. Highly sophisticated and heavily armed, Murphy discovers that the helicopter is being designed for urban use by a group within the government headed by his old Vietnam nemesis F.E. Cochran, played by Malcolm McDowell. Now, the problem is, a lot of people think that Murphy's insane because he's got really bad PTSD. His LAPD bosses want him gone from the job because he keeps losing partners due to passing out at the controls of his helicopter and going crazy. However, Murphy steals Blue Thunder in an attempt to reveal the murderous conspiracy behind its creation, culminating in a series of spectacular dogfights in the skies above downtown Los Angeles. Now, during the early 80s, the comic book style techno-thriller was in vogue. Usually these thrillers revolved around lone wolf cops or military men given access to highly sophisticated weaponized vehicles they used to do battle with the forces of evil, or in the case of many early 80s action movies, communism. On TV, there was Knight Rider, starring David Hasselhoff and a talking car, and on the big screen, there was the infamous flop Megaforce, starring Barry Bostwick, a flying motorcycle, and, well, Barry Bostwick's weird perm. Super helicopters and planes were especially popular, with Clint Eastwood's bizarre spy sci-fi thriller Firefox featuring him stealing a Russian jet that's run by telepathy. While on TV, there was the show Airwolf starring Jan Michael Vincent, which has a lot of similarities to Blue Thunder and came out about a year or so after the film. Many believe it was actually a ripoff of this movie, and I have to say this movie itself spawned a very, very, very short-lived TV version starring, of all people, Dana Carvey. Unlike many movies featured in this column, Blue Thunder was actually a sizable hit, raking up $42 million in 1983 dollars, which would be equal to over $100 million today. That's really not bad considering that 2 weeks after it opened, a little movie called Return of the Jedi hit theaters and kinda took the air out of the box office. Blue Thunder was so well received that in the days before sequels became commonplace, it quickly spawned a rip-off TV show. And it was rushed to the air only 7 months after this hit theaters, meaning that they had to recycle pretty much all the action scenes. It really didn't last long, probably only about 11 episodes, but this film itself became kind of a cult hit on video and cable. And it's funny because by the time this actually hit cable, the TV show was long gone. Director John Badham went on to hit after hit for the rest of the decade, including the same year's War Games, which was even bigger hit, Short Circuit, and Stakeout, before returning to TV in the mid-90s after a couple of flops, including the surprisingly decent Nick of Time, which starred a young Johnny Depp and Christopher Walken. Nevertheless, Blue Thunder has sunk into a kind of modest obscurity. It's well known enough that Sony has reissued it a few times on DVD and Blu-ray, but it's really rarely talked about alongside other popular action movies of the era, maybe due to the lack of a marquee star in the lead. There's been some talk about remaking it with drones, which isn't a bad idea as far as these things go, but nothing has really come to fruition yet. Now, Blue Thunder is both typical and atypical of its era. In addition to the sleek, high-tech vehicle, the hero is also a PTSD-afflicted Vietnam vet, which was something that was so common in movies back in the early 80s that the similarly themed Firefox, which came out a year before, had a hero played by Clint Eastwood with the exact same issue. Yet, while many Reagan-era actioners had a somewhat conservative, rah-rah America bent, Blue Thunder was anti-authoritarian. Here, the government is seen as kind of a sinister force, with the main conflict being that if Blue Thunder is mass-produced, citizens may find themselves unwittingly under surveillance, something which, 33 years later, has indeed happened, although the new watchers really don't need anything quite as clunky as helicopters. Now, Roy Scheider himself explained it pretty well in an interview that he gave around this time, saying that the story supposes that some right think tank or conservative group in the government decides it would be a great idea for crowd control in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles to use these helicopters for surveillance and to arm them, which is a pretty frightening idea. Unfortunately, the other equipment they want to put on board is equipment that could look through your house, see anything that's alive, and be able to record any conversation from 500-600 feet up in the air. The ship then becomes a representation of the total invasion of privacy, a flying Big Brother. In the film, the character I play, Murphy, a Los Angeles helicopter pilot, knows this is a very evil and unnecessary thing, so he does something about it. Now, as Murphy, Roy Scheider played the last of the great 80s everyman heroes, with he-men like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone waiting in the wings to take over action flicks within a year or two. Scheider is more of a 70s style lead, in that he uses his brain and wit rather than brawn and doesn't trust the man. Now, Scheider was the king of this type of hero during this time, with this not too far removed from his role as Chief Brody in Jaws and Jaws 2. Already in his 50s, Scheider brought a rugged world weariness to the part that really made Frank Murphy an interesting guy, and it's pretty cool that this is
is actually his follow-up to All That Jazz, which he was nominated for an Oscar for. There's a terrific introduction at the beginning of this movie that shows him using a high-tech for the time digital watch to count backwards as he tries to calm himself enough to climb into the pilot seat of his helicopter.
Mind if I ask what you're doing?
No, I don't mind at all.
Now you could really see why Roy Scheider in this scene was a cut above the rest. Not your typical action hero, he was vulnerable. For much of the running time, you're really never sure if Murphy's up to the task of taking on the government plot behind Blue Thunder, but by the time the credits roll, he's just about eked out a victory, but at a heavy cost. Similarly, the villain is quite atypical of the time, with Malcolm McDowell low-key as Murphy's rival F.E. Cochran, a government agent who tries to frame Murphy for murder once he starts asking too many questions and later faces off with him in a spectacular dogfight above the LA skies. McDowell's lower-key performance, however, may have less to do with acting choices and more to do with the fact that he's absolutely terrified of flying, with his grimaces during the final battle being real, as he was so freaked out about being in a helicopter, and this was no secret. Malcolm McDowell later on gave an interview where he recalled working on Blue Thunder, and this is what he had to say. "I was terrified. We started out filming it on a gimbal thing, a rig designed for that purpose, with the crew moving it around. Then it was really easy to look macho and all that, but it's very different when you're actually up there in the air. They had to retake my stuff several times because I was so scared. It gave them a good laugh. Going under those bridges in the helicopter was simply terrifying. I didn't think we were going to make it. I asked the pilot, we're not going to go under it, are we? We don't have enough room under the bridge. I don't know how wide this thing is. There's just not enough. Oh my god, he just scraped the paint." I still get the old pollywoggles, and that's Malcolm McDowell's word, not mine, in my stomach when I watch that scene. In fact, I'll tell you, I can't even look at some parts of this movie. The supporting cast is really good too, with Daniel Stern as Jaffo, which means just another fucking observer, Lyman Good, the young family man partner who, if you know 80s action movies, well, probably won't be around too long past the second act. Candy Clark makes for a spunky love interest for Scheider, and it's interesting that when the movie starts, they're already in a relationship rather than falling in love as it goes on, while Warren Oates owns every scene as the typical pissed-off police captain, although he's made a lot more sympathetic here than usual given the trope. Given the era, the effects are actually pretty nifty in this film, with a lot of real helicopters used in addition to some pretty good model work and rear projection. In fact, I would say that the special effects here are a lot better than they are in Firefox, which came out a year before but probably cost about twice the amount. And it doesn't have John Dykstra, who did the Star Wars effects, doing the effects here. The action scenes are really top-notch, although one of the movie's dumber aspects is that Murphy engages the villains right over downtown LA, with missiles flying into building and presumably an astronomical body count on the ground. I guess Badham and company thought an air battle over an urban setting would be more exciting, and maybe they're onto something. I mean, heck, it worked for Marvel. Apparently, however, Scheider thought this was absolutely moronic and fought hard to move the battle out to a less populated area, as that's what he thought Murphy would do. Of course, it didn't quite work out, and Scheider himself said in an interview, "I would get rid of that Arrow Tower scene. It seemed out of character for Murphy to draw missile fire to it. To my way of thinking, they should have picked a place which was obviously abandoned where innocent people wouldn't be endangered." Kind of hard to argue with Roy Scheider there. He makes a lot of sense, but you know, Hollywood is Hollywood and they like big bangs. That aside, Blue Thunder is pretty damn exciting, with Scheider's performance grounding the film in a big way, while Badham's straightforward, some might even say workmanlike, direction a far cry from today's action directors, who bombard you with carnage. I also really like the super synthy electronic score by Arthur B. Rubinstein, with Murphy having a cool heroic theme that I'm humming to myself right now. Bow, 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 bow. Bow, 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 bow. One of the reasons that Blue Thunder works as well as it does is the acting, and I love Roy Scheider's chemistry with Malcolm McDowell, especially the way that Roy Scheider just kind of takes the piss out of him by imitating his accent.
Follow my leader.
Follow my leader.
Be on the pad, 12 sharp.
12 sharp.
Love the scene where him and Oates are called out to a demonstration of the Blue Thunder, and they meet with Cochran for the first time. I also love how later on in the movie, Roy Scheider describes F.E. Cochran by saying that the initials F.E. stand for, in his words, fuck everybody.
F.E. What's the F.E. stand for?
Fuck everybody.
Now, Blue Thunder is widely available on DVD, Blu-ray, iTunes, Amazon, and Netflix, depending on your region, and Crackle also offers it from time to time, but be careful, because it's not always in the proper 2:35:1 aspect ratio. First time I remember seeing this movie was when I was about 18 back in 1999, and it showed on an oldies cable channel.
called MPix, which existed here in Canada for a while. And over the years, I've returned to this one quite a bit, and it remains one of my favorite Roy Scheider vehicles. And it's really too bad that despite its box office success, it was his last big theatrical hit, with him following up with 2 underrated movies. Peter Hyams' 2010, which was only a modest success at the box office, despite being a good movie, and John Frankenheimer's 52 Pickup, which was a huge flop, but a great movie. If you like Roy Scheider in this movie, of course watch the first 2 Jaws movies, as if you haven't seen them. I think everybody's seen them at this point, specifically the first one. And of course, All That Jazz, directed by Bob Fosse. That's a great movie. But Blue Thunder, absolutely amazing movie. Check it out. I think you'll all really like it. And until next time, I'm Chris Bumbray for JoBlo.com.
Do you think you can fly it? You flew it, didn't you? Irritating old cocksucker, isn't he?